Dr. Marcus Thompson was not just any passenger on that flight. He was a man who had dedicated most of his life to serving his country. A retired Army colonel and a highly respected national military advisor, Marcus had spent decades working tirelessly to protect the nation he loved. His career was filled with achievements, advising top military leaders, contributing to strategic decisions, and earning countless accolades for his service. But on this particular evening, none of those accomplishments mattered as much as they should have. The day had been long but productive. Marcus had attended a high-profile defense conference in Washington, D.C., where experts from around the world gathered to discuss global security challenges. He had delivered a keynote speech that was met with applause, shared insights with colleagues, and networked with influential figures. By the time the conference ended, exhaustion tugged at him, but there was also a sense of satisfaction. As he boarded the commercial flight back to Atlanta, his mind was still buzzing with ideas and reflections from the day's events. Marcus found his seat near the middle of the plane, close to the wing. It wasn't first class, but it didn't matter to him. He preferred simplicity over luxury anyway. Settling into his chair, he placed his laptop bag under the seat in front of him and adjusted his tie. The cabin was alive with the usual pre-flight bustle, flight attendants moving. Up and down the aisles, passengers stowing their carry-ons, children laughing, and adults chatting. Marcus exchanged polite smiles with the people seated nearby, nodding hello without saying much. He was tired, but his calm demeanor made him seem approachable. As the boarding process wrapped up and the last few passengers shuffled to their seats, Marcus pulled out his laptop. He wanted to review some notes before takeoff, hoping to organize his thoughts while the details of the conference were still fresh in his mind. Opening the document, he leaned slightly forward, his fingers poised over the keyboard. Everything about his posture suggested focus and professionalism. Yet unbeknownst to him, two men sitting a few rows ahead were watching him closely. These two men were off-duty police officers returning from a training seminar. They hadn't noticed Marcus during boarding or when he took his seat. But now, as they glanced around the cabin, something about him caught their attention. Maybe it was the way he carried himself, confident, composed, almost authoritative. Or perhaps it was the color of his skin, which seemed to trigger an unconscious bias they weren't even aware they harbored. Whatever the reason, their eyes kept darting toward him, lingering longer than necessary. At first, Marcus didn't notice. He was too absorbed in his work, typing away quietly. But after a while, he began to feel uneasy. There was a strange energy in the air, a tension that hadn't been there before. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw the two officers whispering to each other, occasionally glancing in his direction. Their body language changed. They shifted uncomfortably in their seats, leaning closer together as if plotting something. Marcus couldn't hear what they were saying, but the intensity of their stares made him uneasy. He tried to brush it off, telling himself it was nothing. After all, he was just another passenger trying to get home. What could possibly be suspicious about reviewing notes on a laptop? Still, the feeling lingered, gnawing at the edges of his consciousness. To distract himself, he reached for his phone and checked his emails. Nothing urgent popped up, so he put it away and returned to his laptop. But the officers weren't done observing him. One of them nudged the other, nodding subtly toward Marcus. Then, one of them pulled out his phone and started typing furiously. Marcus couldn't see what he was writing, but the act itself felt ominous. Was he sending a message? Reporting something? The thought crossed Marcus's mind briefly, but he dismissed it. Surely no one would accuse him of anything wrong based on such flimsy observations. Minutes ticked by, and the plane prepared for takeoff. The engines roared to life, vibrating through the fuselage. Passengers buckled their seatbelts, and the flight attendants demonstrated safety procedures. Marcus followed along mechanically, double-checking his own belt and storing his laptop safely. Just as the plane began taxiing toward the runway, a flight attendant approached him. She looked nervous, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Is everything okay here?" Marcus blinked, surprised by the question. "Yes, everything's fine," he replied calmly. Why do you ask? She hesitated, glancing over her shoulder as if seeking guidance. I just wanted to make sure you're comfortable. We had a report that someone might be acting suspiciously. His stomach dropped. Suspicious? Him? He forced himself to stay, composed, though his heart rate quickened. I'm just reviewing some notes from a meeting, he explained, gesturing to his laptop. There's nothing unusual going on. The flight attendant nodded but didn't leave immediately. Instead, she lingered awkwardly, clearly unsure of what to do next. Finally, she muttered an apology and walked away, leaving Marcus more confused than ever. Suspicion hung heavy in the air, thick enough to choke on. Something was very wrong, and he knew it wouldn't end well. As the plane continued its journey toward the runway, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, not just by the officers, but by everyone else on board. He glanced around the cabin, catching glimpses of curious faces peeking over seatbacks or turning sideways to look at him. Some looked concerned, others intrigued, but none offered reassurance. For the first time in years, Marcus felt truly alone, isolated in a sea of strangers who saw him not as a decorated veteran or a trusted advisor, but as someone who didn't belong. And then came the announcement over the intercom, a request for all passengers to remain seated while a situation was addressed. The word sent a ripple of unease through the cabin. Whispers erupted among the travelers, and heads turned instinctively toward Marcus. He sat rigidly in his seat, his mind racing. Whatever was happening, he realized it was directed at him, and whatever came next, he braced himself for the worst. The moment the announcement echoed through the cabin, a heavy silence fell over the plane. Passengers exchanged nervous glances, their curiosity piqued by the vague mention of a situation. Some craned their necks to see what was happening, while others whispered theories to their seatmates. The air grew tense, thick with anticipation and unease. Marcus sat frozen in his seat, his hands gripping the armrests tightly. He could feel dozens of eyes on him now, staring as if he were some kind of spectacle. His heart pounded in his chest, but outwardly he remained calm, refusing to let fear take hold. It didn't take long for the source of the tension to reveal itself. From the front of the plane, the captain emerged, flanked by two uniformed sky marshals who had been on board as part of standard security protocol. They moved quickly down the aisle, their faces stern and focused. Behind them trailed a flight attendant, her expression pinched with anxiety. As they approached Marcus's row, the murmurs among passengers grew louder. People shifted in their seats, trying to get a better view of what was unfolding. When the group stopped beside Marcus, time seemed to slow down. One of the sky marshals stepped forward, his hand resting conspicuously on the holster at his side. "Sir," he said sharply, his voice cutting through the low hum of conversation, "please raise your hands above your head." Marcus blinked, stunned. For a split second, he thought there might be some misunderstanding, a mix-up that could easily be cleared up with an explanation. But the marshal's tone left no room for negotiation. Every eye in the cabin was trained on him now, waiting to see how he would respond. Slowly, deliberately, Marcus raised his hands, keeping his movements smooth and deliberate to avoid alarming anyone further. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice steady despite the knot of dread forming in his stomach. "I'm just a passenger. I haven't done anything wrong." The marshal ignored the question, instead barking orders to his partner. "Secure the area. Make sure no one gets too close." Then turning back to Marcus, he added, "We've received reports of suspicious activity involving you. We need to ensure everyone's safety." Suspicious activity? Marcus's mind raced. What could possibly qualify as suspicious? He had been doing nothing more than reviewing notes on his laptop, notes related to the defense conference he'd attended earlier that day. There was nothing incriminating or out of the ordinary about his actions. Yet here he was, being treated like a criminal in front of dozens of strangers. As the second marshal positioned himself nearby, Marcus felt a surge of frustration bubbling beneath his carefully controlled exterior. This wasn't right, it couldn't be. He glanced around the cabin, hoping anyone might speak up in his defense. Surely someone must have noticed that he posed no threat. But the other passengers avoided his gaze, their expressions ranging from shock to discomfort to outright suspicion. No one said a word. Meanwhile, the first marshal reached into Marcus's bag, pulling out his laptop and rifling through its contents. Marcus winced inwardly as he watched the man handle his device carelessly, opening files and scrolling through documents without permission. These weren't just random notes. They contained sensitive information related to national security matters. If this continued, it wouldn't just be embarrassing, it could jeopardize classified discussions and strategies. "Do you realize what you're handling?" Marcus interjected, his tone firmer now. "This isn't just personal stuff, it's confidential material tied to my work. You shouldn't be touching it." The marshal paused briefly, glancing at Marcus before resuming his search. "We'll determine what's relevant," he replied curtly. "Right now, our priority is ensuring the safety of everyone on this plane." Safety. That word again. Marcus clenched his jaw, fighting the urge to argue further. He knew protesting too much might only make things worse. Instead, he tried another. "Look," he said evenly. "I understand you're following protocol, but I can explain who I am. I'm a retired Army colonel and a military advisor. I've spent decades serving this country. This is all a big misunderstanding." For a fleeting moment, he thought he saw doubt flicker across the marshal's face. But then the man shook his head, dismissing Marcus's words. "We'll verify your identity later. Right now, we need to remove you from the aircraft." Remove him? The realization hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. They weren't just questioning him. They intended to escort him off the plane entirely. Humiliation burned in his chest as he imagined walking past rows of judgmental eyes, his hands cuffed behind his back, reduced to a spectacle for gawking passengers. How could this be happening? He wasn't a threat. He was a decorated veteran, a trusted public servant, and yet, none of that mattered in this moment. With little ceremony, the marshals instructed Marcus to stand up. Passengers leaned back in, their seats to give him space, some looking away while others stared openly. A mother covered her child's eyes, whispering something Marcus couldn't hear. Each reaction stung, adding to the weight of the injustice unfolding before him. As he rose to his feet, he locked eyes with one elderly woman seated nearby. Her expression was unreadable, but there was a flicker of sympathy in her gaze that gave him a small measure of comfort. Once standing, Marcus was ordered to turn around so his wrists could be secured with plastic zip ties. The sharp click of the restraints tightening around his skin sent a shiver down his spine. He hated the feeling, not because it hurt, but because it symbolized everything wrong with the situation. Here he was, a man who had dedicated his life to protecting others, now being treated as if he were dangerous. The irony wasn't lost on him. The walk down the aisle felt endless. With every step, Marcus became acutely aware of the whispers trailing behind him. "What did he do?" he heard someone ask quietly. Another voice speculated, "Maybe he's carrying something illegal." Each comment pierced him like a dagger, fueling both anger and sadness. Did these people not see him as human? Could they not recognize the absurdity of accusing someone like him, a professional, a leader, of wrongdoing based on nothing more than baseless suspicion? When the group finally reached the exit, the flight attendants held the door open, their expressions a mixture of relief and guilt. Outside, the tarmac stretched endlessly under harsh floodlights, casting long shadows across the ground. A police van idled nearby, its red and blue lights flashing ominously. Officers stood waiting, their postures rigid and alert. Marcus took a deep breath as he descended the stairs, bracing himself for whatever came next. Though he kept his composure intact, inside, Marcus was seething. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every person of color who had ever been judged unfairly because of prejudice. It was about the systemic biases that allowed such injustices to happen over and over again. And as he stood there on the tarmac, surrounded by armed officers and glaring lights, Marcus vowed to fight back, not just for himself but for everyone who deserved better. The harsh floodlights of the tarmac illuminated every detail. making Marcus feel as though he were standing on a stage under an unforgiving spotlight. The cold night air bit at his skin, contrasting sharply with the warmth of embarrassment and anger coursing through him. Officers surrounded him in a loose semicircle, their hands resting on holstered weapons, their expressions unreadable. To them, he wasn't a decorated veteran or a trusted military advisor. He was just another suspect, someone who needed to be controlled until proven otherwise. One officer stepped forward, clipboard in hand, his tone clipped and impersonal. "State your name and provide identification," he barked as if addressing a common criminal. Marcus clenched his jaw but complied, speaking slowly and clearly. "My name is Dr. Marcus Thompson. I'm a retired Army colonel and a national military advisor." He nodded toward his wallet, which had been confiscated during the initial search. "You'll find my military ID and credentials inside." The officer hesitated for a fraction of a second before retrieving the wallet from a nearby table where Marcus's belongings had been placed. Flipping it open, he scanned the contents silently. For a brief moment, doubt flickered across his face. Marcus could see it in the way his eyebrows twitched upward, but it vanished almost instantly. Instead of acknowledging the significance of what he held in his hands, the officer simply muttered, "We'll verify this." Verify? Marcus wanted to scream. How much verification did they need? His identification was official, issued by the United States government, bearing his photo, rank, and serial number. Yet here he stood, still treated like a threat. It was infuriating, but Marcus forced himself to stay calm. Losing his temper wouldn't help. It would only give them more ammunition to paint him as aggressive or unstable. As the minutes dragged, Marcus grew increasingly aware of the spectacle unfolding around him. Airport staff milled about in the background, pretending not to stare but clearly fascinated by the drama. A few passengers disembarked from the plane, peering curiously at the scene before hurrying away. One young man paused longer than necessary, snapping a photo with his phone before being ushered along by security personnel. Marcus sighed inwardly. This wasn't just an embarrassing ordeal. It was becoming public fodder, the kind of story that could spread like wildfire online. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the officer returned, holding Marcus's ID. "Your credentials check out," he admitted grudgingly, avoiding eye contact. "But we had reports of suspicious behavior. We had to investigate." "Suspicious behavior?" Marcus echoed, incredulous. "What exactly did I do that warranted all this?" He gestured to the handcuffs binding his wrists, the armed officers surrounding him, and the glaring lights overhead. "I was reviewing notes on my laptop, that's it, nothing more." The officer shrugged, his demeanor unchanged. "Safety comes first. Better safe than sorry." Marcus swallowed hard, biting back the retort that rose to his lips. He knew arguing further would accomplish nothing. These men weren't interested in hearing his perspective. They were determined to justify their actions, regardless of how baseless they were. So instead he asked the question that had been gnawing at him since the ordeal began. "Who reported me?" The officer hesitated again, glancing over his shoulder at his colleagues. Clearly this was sensitive territory. After a pause, he replied vaguely, "It came from someone on board. They expressed concerns about your behavior. Concerns about his behavior." The phrase stung deeply. What behavior? Adjusting his seatbelt? Typing on his laptop? Simply existing while black? Marcus didn't voice these thoughts aloud, but they burned within him, fueling a mix of frustration and despair. He realized then that no matter how accomplished or respectable he was, there would always be people who saw him through a lens of prejudice, and institutions willing to act on those biases without question. With little ceremony, the officers removed the zip ties from Marcus's wrists and handed back his belongings. "You're free to go," one of them said curtly, as if dismissing a nuisance rather than releasing an innocent man. No apology followed, no acknowledgement of the humiliation he had endured. Just a curt nod and a wave toward the terminal building. Walking. A way felt surreal. Each step seemed heavier than the last, weighed down by the injustice of what had transpired. As Marcus entered the bustling airport concourse, he noticed people staring at him, not with curiosity this time, but with pity or disdain. Some whispered behind cupped hands, their words indistinct but their meaning clear. Others avoided looking at him altogether, as if his presence made them uncomfortable. Marcus kept his head high, refusing to let their reactions break him, but the cumulative effect was exhausting. By the time he reached the baggage claim area, his phone buzzed incessantly in his pocket. Notifications poured in from friends, family, and colleagues who had somehow learned about the incident. News traveled fast, especially in an age of social media. Videos and photos taken by fellow passengers were already circulating online, accompanied by headlines questioning whether racial profiling had played a role. Marcus scrolled through the messages briefly, his heart sinking as he read comments both supportive and accusatory. Some praised him for maintaining composure, calling him a hero for enduring such blatant discrimination. Others accused him of exaggerating the situation, claiming he must have done something to provoke suspicion. Exhaustion overwhelmed him. All he wanted was to go home, crawl into bed, and forget the events of the evening. But even as he hailed a taxi outside the airport, he knew sleep wouldn't come easily. His mind raced with questions. Why had this happened? What could he have done differently? And most importantly, how could he prevent it from happening again, to himself or to others? When Marcus finally arrived home, he found his wife, Elena, waiting anxiously in the living room. Her face fell when she saw him, her eyes filling with tears. "Oh, Marcus," she whispered, rushing to embrace him. "I saw the news. Are you okay?" He hugged her tightly, drawing strength from her warmth and concern. "I'm fine," he murmured, though they both knew it wasn't entirely true. Physically, he was unharmed, but emotionally, he was raw. He recounted the evening's events, in fragments, his voice trembling with suppressed emotion. Elena listened silently, her expression shifting between outrage and sorrow. When he finished, she took his hand firmly in hers. "You can't let this destroy you," she said softly but firmly. "This isn't your fault, Marcus. You know that, right? This is about them. Their fear, their ignorance, their bias. Not you." Her words resonated deeply, grounding him in a way he desperately needed. She was right. This wasn't about him personally. It was about a system that allowed such injustices to occur unchecked. And if anything positive could come from this experience, it was the opportunity to shine a light on that system, to demand accountability and change. Over the next few days, Marcus wrestled with conflicting emotions. Anger simmered beneath the surface, threatening to boil over whenever he thought about the officers' dismissive attitudes or the passengers' judgmental stares. Sadness crept in, too, as he reflected on the countless others who had likely faced similar treatment without the platform or resources to fight back. But alongside these emotions was a growing sense of resolve. If his story could spark a conversation about racial profiling and systemic bias, then perhaps his suffering wouldn't be in vain. That resolve crystallized when a reporter called, asking for an interview. At first, Marcus hesitated. Speaking publicly meant reliving the trauma, exposing himself to criticism and scrutiny. But as he considered the broader implications, he realized silence wasn't an option. Too many voices had been silenced for too long. If he refused to speak up, who would? "Yes," he told the reporter, his voice steady despite the weight of the decision. "I'll talk, but not just about me. About everyone who has faced this kind of injustice. This isn't just my story, it's theirs too." And so Marcus began preparing for the next chapter of his journey. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be pushback, skepticism, and resistance. But he also knew that staying silent wasn't an option. For himself, for his family, and for future generations, he vowed to turn this painful experience into a catalyst for change. A reminder that progress often begins with pain, but it doesn't end there. The day of the press conference arrived, and Marcus felt a mix of emotions swirling inside him: nervousness, determination, and a deep sense of responsibility. He stood in front of a mirror in his home office, adjusting his tie for what felt like the 100th time. The knot had to be perfect, not too tight, not too loose. It wasn't vanity, it was symbolism. Today, he wanted to present himself as the man he truly was, composed, professional, and unshaken despite the storm he had endured. His wife, Elena, hovered nearby, straightening his lapel and offering quiet words of encouragement. "You're ready for this," she said softly, her voice steady but filled with pride. "This isn't just about you anymore. You're speaking for everyone who's ever been treated unfairly because of the color of their skin." Her words struck a chord within him. This moment wasn't about revenge or settling scores. It was about shining a light on systemic issues that had festered for far too long. As he stepped outside into the crisp morning air, cameras clicked and reporters shouted questions from behind barricades set up along his driveway. Word had spread quickly about the press conference, and media outlets from across the country were eager to hear his story. Flashes of light illuminated his face as he walked toward the small podium erected on his lawn. Friends, neighbors, and supporters gathered around, some holding signs that read, "Justice for all and end racial profiling." When Marcus finally took his place at the podium, the crowd quieted, anticipation hanging heavy in the air. For a brief moment, he scanned the sea of faces before him, young and old, black and white, strangers and loved ones. Each pair of eyes carried its own weight: curiosity, empathy, skepticism, hope. Taking a deep breath, Marcus leaned slightly forward, gripping the edges of the podium with both hands. "Good morning," he began, his voice strong and clear despite the whirlwind of emotions churning beneath the surface. "My name is Dr. Marcus Thompson. I am a retired Army colonel, a national military advisor, and most importantly, a husband, father, and citizen of this great nation." He paused, letting the titles sink in. "On Tuesday evening, I boarded a flight in Washington, D.C., intending to return home after attending a defense conference. What happened next was something no one should ever experience." As he recounted the events of that night, Marcus spoke deliberately, painting a vivid picture of the fear, confusion, and humiliation he had felt. He described the suspicious stares from the off-duty officers, the intrusive search of his belongings, and the cold indifference of the marshals who refused to acknowledge his credentials. His tone remained measured, but there was an undercurrent of emotion that resonated deeply with the audience. When he spoke of being handcuffed and escorted off the plane in full view of other passengers, his voice cracked slightly, betraying the pain he had worked so hard to conceal. "I served this country honorably for over 30 years. He continued, his gaze steady and unwavering. "I've advised top military leaders, contributed to strategies that protect our freedoms, and risked my life to ensure the safety of others. Yet because of the color of my skin, I was treated like a criminal. Not once did anyone stop to ask if I was okay or even listen when I tried to explain who I was. Instead, assumptions were made, biases were acted upon, and justice was ignored." A murmur rippled through the crowd, a mixture of gasps, sighs, and murmured affirmations. Some people nodded vigorously, while others wiped away tears. Marcus noticed a young boy standing near the front, clutching his mother's hand tightly. The child's wide-eyed expression reminded him of why he was doing this, not just for himself, but for future generations who deserved better. "This isn't just my story," Marcus emphasized, leaning closer to the microphone. "It's the story of countless individuals who have faced similar treatment simply because of how they look, where they come from, or what they wear. It's the story of racial profiling, a practice that has no place in a society built on principles of equality and fairness, and it's the story of a system that allows such injustices to happen again and again without accountability." He paused, allowing his words to settle over the audience. Then, shifting gears, he addressed those who might dismiss his experience as an isolated incident or accuse him of exaggerating the situation. Some will say this was a mistake, a misunderstanding that can be brushed aside with a simple apology. But let me tell you, friends, mistakes rooted in bias are not harmless. They erode trust, they perpetuate stereotypes, and they leave scars that don't heal easily. Marcus went on to share statistics about racial profiling in transportation, and law enforcement, citing studies that highlighted disparities in how people of color were treated compared to their white counterparts. He pointed out that incidents like his weren't rare. They were part of a larger pattern, one that needed to be dismantled piece by piece. "We cannot continue to ignore these patterns," he declared. "We cannot pretend they don't exist, or convince ourselves that progress has already been made. Real change requires action, not complacency." By the time he concluded his speech, the atmosphere had shifted. The initial tension gave way to a shared sense of purpose, as though the crowd had collectively decided to stand with Marcus in his fight for justice. Applause erupted, growing louder and more passionate with each passing second. People cheered, whistled, and clapped, their admiration evident. Reporters scrambled to capture every detail, snapping photos and jotting down notes furiously. But the reaction wasn't limited to those present. Within minutes of the press conference ending, video clips of Marcus's speech began circulating online. Social media platforms lit up with hashtags like "Stand with Marcus," "No to Racial Profiling," and "Justice for All." Supporters praised his courage and eloquence, calling him a beacon of hope in a world often clouded by prejudice. Civil rights organizations reached out, offering partnerships and resources to amplify his message. Politicians issued statements condemning the incident and promising to push for reforms. Not everyone was supportive, however. Critics accused Marcus of playing the victim, arguing that law enforcement officials were simply doing their jobs. Some commenters dismissed his claims of racial profiling, insisting that safety protocols must always take precedence, even if innocent people occasionally got caught in the crossfire. Others suggested he was using the incident to gain attention or further a political agenda. Reading these comments late at night, Marcus couldn't help but feel disheartened. The negativity seemed endless, a barrage of vitriol designed to undermine his credibility and silence his voice. But then he remembered something Elena had told him earlier that week. The loudest voices aren't always the most important ones. She was right. While trolls might dominate social media feeds, the real impact lay in the quieter, steadier responses. The messages of gratitude from fellow survivors of racial profiling, the pledges of support from allies committed to change, the emails from young activists inspired to join the fight. Buoyed by this realization, Marcus threw himself into advocacy work. He partnered with civil rights groups to launch a campaign aimed at addressing racial bias in policing and transportation security. Together, they drafted policy proposals, organized community forums, and lobbied lawmakers to introduce legislation requiring stricter oversight of law enforcement interactions with civilians. One of their key initiatives focused on implementing mandatory implicit bias training for all officers and aviation personnel, emphasizing the importance of recognizing and combating prejudiced assumptions. The campaign gained momentum rapidly, drawing attention from influential figures across various sectors. Activists praised Marcus's leadership, crediting him with bringing much-needed visibility to an issue that had long been overlooked. Veterans organizations rallied behind him, highlighting the irony of a decorated soldier being treated as a threat. Even some law enforcement agencies expressed willingness to engage in dialogue, acknowledging the need for reform. Despite the progress, Marcus knew the road ahead would be long and challenging. Change didn't happen overnight, especially when it involved dismantling deeply entrenched systems of inequality. There would be setbacks, resistance, and moments of doubt. But whenever he felt overwhelmed, he reminded himself of the faces he'd seen during the press conference. The young boy clinging to his mother's hand, the elderly woman wiping away tears, the college student holding a sign that read, "Enough is enough." Those faces kept him grounded, reminding him why he had chosen to speak out in the first place. One evening, as he sat on his porch watching the sunset, Elena joined him, handing him a cup of tea. "You've done good work today," she said, sitting beside him, "and tomorrow you'll do more. That's how change happens, one step at a time." Marcus smiled faintly, sipping his tea as the sky turned shades of orange and pink. He knew she was right. The journey wouldn't be easy, but it was worth it. Every voice raised, every policy challenged, every heart changed brought them closer to a world where no one would have to endure what he had. And for Marcus, that vision of a brighter future was enough to keep him moving forward one day at a time. Months passed since the incident, and Marcus's life had transformed in ways he never anticipated. What began as a deeply personal ordeal had evolved into a national movement, with his story sparking conversations about racial profiling, systemic bias, and accountability within law enforcement. The campaign he launched alongside civil rights organizations gained traction, drawing attention from lawmakers, activists, and everyday citizens who were ready for change. Yet, despite the progress, Marcus knew that true justice required more than just awareness. It demanded action. The internal investigation into the officers involved in his detention revealed troubling patterns of behavior. Records showed that several complaints had been filed against them in the past, alleging similar instances of racial profiling. While none of these complaints had led to significant consequences, the mounting evidence forced authorities to take action this time. Both officers were suspended without pay and mandated to undergo extensive sensitivity training. Additionally, the airline faced public backlash, prompting executives to issue a formal apology and implement new protocols aimed at preventing such incidents in the future. However, Marcus wasn't satisfied with these measures. To him, suspensions and apologies felt like band-aids on a gaping wound, temporary fixes that failed to address the root cause of the problem. He believed real change required structural reforms, starting with legislation that held law enforcement accountable for discriminatory practices. With this goal in mind, he dedicated himself to advocating for policy changes at both state and federal levels. His efforts paid off when a bipartisan group of legislators introduced the Fair Treatment in Transportation Act, inspired by Marcus's advocacy. The bill proposed stricter regulations for how law enforcement interacted with passengers during flights, including mandatory de-escalation training, independent oversight boards to review misconduct allegations, and penalties for agencies that failed to comply. It also called for increased transparency, requiring airlines and police departments to publicly report data on passenger detentions, broken down by race, gender, and other demographic factors. The introduction of the bill marked a turning point in Marcus's journey. For the first time, he saw tangible hope for systemic change, a framework that could protect others from experiencing what he had endured. But passing the bill wouldn't be easy. Lobbyists representing law enforcement, unions pushed back fiercely, arguing that additional regulations would hinder officers' ability to maintain safety. Critics accused Marcus and his allies of undermining authority and creating unnecessary bureaucracy. Determined to counter these arguments, Marcus embarked on a nationwide speaking tour. He visited community centers, college campuses, and town halls, sharing his story and explaining why reform was essential. At each stop, he emphasized the importance of balancing security with fairness. "No one is asking for officers to ignore potential threats," he often said during his speeches. "We're asking them to approach every situation with professionalism, respect, and an open mind. That's not too much to ask." His message resonated deeply with audiences, particularly young people eager to make a difference. Students organized rallies in support of the bill, using social media to amplify their voices. Teachers incorporated discussions about racial profiling into their lesson plans, encouraging students to think critically about privilege and power dynamics. Even some law enforcement officials began speaking out in favor of reform, acknowledging that trust between communities and police could only be rebuilt through meaningful accountability. Despite the growing momentum, opposition remained fierce. Marcus received hate mail daily, letters filled with insults, threats, and accusations that he was dividing the country. Some critics dismissed him as opportunistic, claiming he was exploiting his experience for personal gain. Others argued that addressing racial profiling diverted attention from real issues like crime rates or border security. These attacks weighed heavily on Marcus, but he refused to let them derail his mission. Instead, he leaned on his support system, Elena, his family, close friends, and fellow advocates, who reminded him why his work mattered. One particularly challenging moment came when a conservative talk show host invited Marcus onto his program. promising a balanced discussion about racial profiling. What unfolded instead was a hostile interrogation, with the host repeatedly interrupting Marcus and twisting his words to fit a predetermined narrative. Viewers called in, hurling insults and questioning Marcus's credibility. By the end of the segment, Marcus felt drained and defeated. But as he scrolled through social media afterward, he discovered thousands of messages from supporters thanking him for staying composed under pressure. Many praised his ability to remain calm and articulate, even when provoked. Their encouragement reminded him that setbacks were inevitable, but giving up was not an option. As the months went by, the Fair Treatment in Transportation Act slowly made its way through legislative committees, gaining co-sponsors and earning endorsements from influential organizations. Meanwhile, Marcus continued expanding his advocacy beyond aviation security. Recognizing that racial profiling extended far beyond airports, he partnered with grassroots groups working to combat discrimination in schools, workplaces, and neighborhoods. Together, they developed educational resources, hosted workshops, and created safe spaces for individuals to share their experiences. One initiative that stood out was a storytelling project called Voices Unseen. Participants submitted anonymous accounts of racial profiling, which were then compiled into a digital archive accessible to the public. The stories ranged from heartbreaking to infuriating, shedding light on the pervasive nature of bias. A young woman described being followed around a store simply because she wore a hijab. A teenage boy recounted being stopped by police while walking home from basketball practice. An elderly man shared how he was denied service at a restaurant because of his accent. Each narrative added depth to the conversation, humanizing statistics, and underscoring the urgent need for change. Through it all, Marcus remained steadfast in his belief that progress was possible, even if it came in small increments. He celebrated victories, no matter how minor they seemed. When a local police department adopted body cameras as part of its standard equipment, he applauded the move as a step toward transparency. When a major airline implemented diversity training for its staff, he praised the effort as a sign of willingness to grow. And when a high school student emailed him to say his speech had inspired her to pursue a career in social justice, he saved the message, knowing it represented the ripple effect of his work. Finally, after nearly a year of relentless advocacy, the Fair Treatment in Transportation Act reached the floor of Congress for a vote. The debate was heated, with lawmakers passionately arguing both for and against the bill. Supporters highlighted its potential to prevent abuses of power and restore public trust, while opponents warned of unintended consequences and bureaucratic red tape. As the final votes were tallied, Marcus sat anxiously in front of his television, surrounded by Elena and their children. When the announcement came, "The bill has passed," tears streamed down his face. They weren't tears of relief or triumph, but of gratitude. Gratitude for everyone who had stood beside him, fought with him, and believed in the possibility of a better world. In the weeks following the bill's passage, Marcus reflected on everything he had endured and achieved. The scars from that night on the tarmac would always remain, reminders of the pain caused by prejudice and ignorance. But so too would the lessons he learned. That resilience could transform suffering into purpose. That courage could inspire others to act. And that unity could overcome division. He often thought back to the young boy he'd seen at his press conference, the one clutching his mother's hand as though holding on to hope itself. Marcus imagined that boy growing up in a world where his skin color didn't determine how he was treated, where his dreams weren't limited by stereotypes, where justice truly applied to all. That vision kept Marcus grounded, reminding him why he had chosen to speak out in the first place. And so Dr. Marcus Thompson's story became more than just a tale of injustice. It became a testament to perseverance, compassion, and the enduring fight for equality. For Marcus, it wasn't enough to simply survive adversity. He chose to rise above it, using his voice to uplift others and create a legacy of change. In doing so, he proved that even in the darkest moments, there is always room for light, and that sometimes the hardest battles yield the most profound victories.